It's time now to talk politics on today's programme. We'll be looking at the government's prison shake-up as well as checking in with the Liberal Democrat peer to see how the government's Brexit bill is getting on in the laws. First, though, we're going to be having a look at immigration numbers, and to do so we're joined in the studio by Jonathan Isaby, editor of BrexitCentral. Jonathan, thank you so much for coming in. We've got two stories we're going to start off looking at. First of all, new numbers showing that net migration has fallen in the year to September, though the ONS, which has calculated the figures, say statistically it's not actually particularly important, the change.
Indeed, that's exactly what the ONS have said, and the net figures are still hovering just slightly below 300,000 rather than slightly above 300,000, which is what it was, which is still a huge number of people. And I'm not someone who's opposed to immigration. I think immigration's a positive for the economy. I think, putting this in the context of the Brexit referendum last year, I think what people wanted in this country was controlled immigration rather than not immigration. Yes. And I think that shows itself to be an issue principally in respect of infrastructure in the country, because it's fantastic having people who want to come and work here and settle here and boost the economy here. But do we necessarily have the school places, the hospital places, the housing for people who are coming over here? And if you're looking at net numbers of nearly 300,000 a year, we know how few homes are being built at the moment. Literally, more people are arriving each year than we are building homes, which means that the housing crisis is getting worse and worse.
So do you say then successive governments, by almost either ignoring net migration or by refusing to face up to the scale of it and thus invest in infrastructure, that they've sort of almost created a problem? So quite clearly, the more people who are here, the more we're going to need hospitals, schools, and everything else.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I lay the blame at successive governments. Obviously, the decision by the Blair government to accept the enlargement of the EU without any control of immigration from the former Eastern Bloc countries. When we were told it was going to be in the tens of thousands, and it's turned out to be in the hundreds of thousands. Massively underestimated that level of immigration. That was certainly an issue. And indeed, on a local level today, you still have councillors of all colours around the country who don't want building in my particular area, but it should happen somewhere else. Well, it's got to happen somewhere, and that the housing crisis remains an issue which I'm not convinced that any party has come up with an acceptable solution to.
But instead of the government saying, OK, these are the migration levels, we must invest more in infrastructure, that isn't what we've had. I mean, Theresa May was the first person to sort of say that we're going to bring immigration down to the tens of thousands when she was Home Secretary. And that still seems to be the government's line. Why the obsession with getting numbers down? As you point out, the migrants who come here are incredibly useful to the economy, and many industries say they're going to have terrible trouble if we don't have these people. So why is the government so obsessed? Do you think that's just because they believe that the people who voted for Brexit want to see that?
I think that there is an issue really here. So it all comes down to control at the end of the day. And again, it comes back to Brexit, that for as long as we're in the European Union, and indeed so long as we're in the single market, which has its famous four freedoms, one of which is freedom of movement throughout the whole of the European Union, we have no control of migration in this country. And I think what people voted for at Brexit at the referendum last year was for the government, the British government, to have control over its borders as to who would and wouldn't come in. The figures we've got today actually show for the first time more people coming from European Union countries than all other countries in the world put together. That's still a significant number, which indeed the government has absolutely no control over. It was a complete lie for David Cameron and indeed Theresa May when she was Home Secretary to say our aim is tens of thousands. They had no control over it. It was impossible to control so long as we're in the European Union.
So what they had control of course, were people from outside the EU, and many businesses we talk to on Share Radio will say, well, one of the problems of this is the fact that there are people with skills that they need to bring in from outside, but that's the area the government is sort of clamping down.
Oh, absolutely. The government effectively was utterly discriminating against huge swathes of people, dare I say it, particularly people from countries with whom we have historic ties, like Australia, New Zealand or Canada. But but was having to, literally leave the door open to anyone from anywhere in the European Union, regardless of whether they had any connection or link to the UK, indeed, whether they even had a job in the UK to go to.
Now, according to Immigration Minister Robert Goodwill, the EU is apparently discussing the possibility of introducing a sort of similar version to America, their sort of ESTA system, so that when we have left the EU, we might also need to sort of go online and pay a certain amount of money in order to get this method of travelling to Europe. A lot of people saying that this would be a very much worse way of doing things. Do we really know how the EU is going to treat British citizens as far as travelling there once we've left?
Well, the simple answer is no, we don't. No, we haven't even yet triggered Article 50, so the negotiations haven't even started yet as to the position that the UK will have in relation to the EU. And we will then have 2 years of negotiations, and in a couple of years' time we will have a new arrangement, and whatever happens will happen. And obviously this is all speculation at the moment. Again, this does all come back to the fact that people at the referendum were keen that the UK government should have control, of British taxpayers' money, but also of our borders, of our trade policy, and our money. And I think it's a perfectly reasonable thing that any country should want to control its borders.
Which countries have a sort of system that you think is actually quite sensible? Australia is often mentioned, for instance, as being a country that assesses the worth of the people who are coming to the country and as a way of controlling it.
Well, I mean, you're going back to the system of work permits, really, whereas in terms of the ESTA system, that's merely about people visiting countries for pleasure or short-term business trips. I mean, I went to the United States several years ago. I paid, I think, a tenner for an ESTA. It took kind of 3 minutes to fill the form in online. You get an email back. You print it out. You can then visit. I think that was a 3-year one. I think you can get them for up to 10 years in some cases. It is not a very bureaucratic system, but it enables the authorities in America to know who's coming and have that element of control, which I think the British people want with respect to this country. And I think all these questions that are coming up about what if, but, here, wherefores, and all the rest of it. A lot of those are coming from people who basically are opposed to Brexit, who are disappointed at the result from last year's referendum and are looking for all kinds of ways to frustrate it, to block it, to moan about the result and ask awkward questions rather than saying, OK, well, that's what the British people voted for. We've got to accept the result. Let's make it work.
Just one more question before we move on, Jonathan. With 3.5 million EU citizens living in the UK at the moment, I mean, how do you think our government should behave towards them? Should we be using them as a bargaining counter for British citizens who are in the EU? Should we let them stay? Do you have any sort of preference?
Oh, I, and indeed the Vote Leave campaign during the referendum, were always clear that people who had already settled here and were living here should absolutely be able to stay. What Theresa May has rightly said is that she wants to settle that at the earliest opportunity. Indeed, she wanted to settle it before Christmas, but it was the European Union leadership who said, no, we're not willing to discuss this until you triggered Article 50. There are obviously some million or so British citizens who are living in the European Union who have equally the same concerns that some EU citizens living in this country may have. On both sides, that should be settled at the earliest opportunity, of course.
OK, thank you.
The Share Radio Evening Show.
Now, as the government's Brexit bill makes its way through the Lords, the Chamber has become the latest stage for Brexit political theatre. Performances have ranged from the cautionary, with peers receiving warnings not to thwart the democratic process, to the unflattering, with the House having been compared by one peer to an elderly daycare centre. But what's really been going on in the Lords? Let's find out from one. Joining us on the line now is Lord Teverson, a Liberal Democrat peer. Thank you for talking to us. So what's the current stage then?
Well, we've got through the second reading, which is when the bill is discussed in general, and we had 190 members of the House make speeches. We were limited to 6 minutes each, which was quite enough, to be honest. And we spent 2 days up to midnight the first day and up to 11 o'clock at night the second, debating it. And at the end, when the Lord Speaker says, is everybody content, people that the government side said content, and when he said no, not anybody not content, which would mean we had to have a vote, everybody held their breath. It was silent. And so we're through to the committee stage where we debate all the amendments for the first time, and that starts next week.
Lord Lamont said during the debate, either you believe in democracy or you do not. Was that particularly helpful? I mean, there is this view, isn't there, that the country's voted, therefore let's just get on with it. That's not, from our previous conversation, necessarily a view you hold.
Well, the problem, no. I mean, the problem about that is that there was we try not to rerun this thing, but there was a referendum. Absolutely, 17 million voted to leave, 16 million voted to stay, and so that's decided. But what we didn't know is what sort of leave we meant, and so that's the whole thing where the House of Lords will now get involved. And if the government thinks it's undemocratic to try to decide what sort of break we're going to have from the European Union, then I don't get that at all. That's clearly something that's important to Parliament, to everybody that voted, the 16 million or the 17 million. Yes.
Do you somehow wish that the referendum bill had been rather differently framed at the beginning?
I suppose if you asked me, I'd rather it didn't happen at all, because it was one of the great things. I do go out on the doorstep a lot in other roles, and Europe, immigration was always a really important issue to everybody. No getting away from that, but Europe was about number 10 ever. So National Health Service, migration, jobs, employment, they were all more important. We should have had a referendum about them, perhaps.
Now, I was quite intrigued. The government has been saying that essentially once we trigger Article 50, that's it. It's all over. But Lord Carr, who was Ambassador, UK Permanent Representative to the European Communities, the European Union, and was one of those people who sort of put the treaty together in the first place, he says that's not actually true.
Well, we don't know. That's the point. His view is that you could get to 1 year and 364 days and say, hang on a minute, we don't like where we're at. We're actually going to withdraw our notice. No one knows that because no one's withdrawn from the European Union yet. And, of course, the irony would be if that was ever contested, and that's why it wasn't contested in the Supreme Court action about Article 50, is it would have to go to the European Court of Justice to decide. And I don't think the government would want that to happen. And but so that is left open. It would be, my view, probably the same as Lord Kerr's, that it could be withdrawn if the British people decided it should be. But it would have to be the British people that decided that.
So the current stage then, when you're sort of looking at the bill and seeing what sort of amendments might be introduced, and what do you think is actually going to happen? What's the mood of the House?
Well, the mood of the House generally is that the House of Commons and the people, the British public, have voted in the majority to leave. So then what we need to do is to try to call government to account and to try to get a sensible route to exit, and this bill gives us some opportunity to do that. So the main amendments that are going down are ones around trying to make the government and the Prime Minister accountable during this process, just as the European Parliament is doing the same on the other side, and particularly this issue that you've just talked about, which is absolutely critical to literally millions of families, is actually saying to EU citizens in the UK now that their situation is safe and that they can stay here and they will be able to stay here in the long term. To put that to bed right now. Plus, the other side, as Liberal Democrats were saying, that the people themselves, those that voted to leave, should have a say on the final deal as well. But those are the sort of amendments that will probably be voted on.
Okay, I've got Jonathan Isaby here, editor of BrexitCentral, who wants to join the conversation.
I mean, look, a lot of the amendments that Lord Teverson just talked about are exactly the amendments that the Commons discussed at its committee stage just a couple of weeks ago, and indeed all of which were defeated by the House of Commons. And I think what we're going to remember here, this bill to give the government permission to trigger Article 50 is a very, very narrow bill. It's 137 words long. It is not about the future position of EU citizens, although I absolutely agree with Lord Teverson, that's a very important issue. It should be settled at the earliest opportunity. And as we discussed earlier, it was the fact that the European Union didn't want to agree to it, that we haven't yet got an agreement on it. But this is not a bill to start kind of tying the government's hands in the negotiations to come. And that's so many of the amendments that are likely to come forward, which I suspect Lord Teverson will be backing, are ones that would tie the government's hands, which would make the negotiation more awkward for the British government. And indeed, the idea of saying, oh, well, it all has to be put to another referendum at the end of it, basically gives the European Union negotiators absolutely every reason to make it as punishing a deal as possible for the UK on the grounds that the British electorate might then reject it and we all go back to square one. The fact is, the British people
I don't think any of that logically works, actually. I don't understand it. You can certainly absolutely agree and say that you shouldn't have a referendum about the result. That's a perfectly respectable thing to say. But the rest of it, I don't think that actually works at all. And it's actually parliamentary democracy that says, yes, we have a referendum which Parliament voted for and we have an answer on that. But in terms of that, does that give a government completely free range to do what it's like? No, that's not parliamentary democracy. That's not. The last thing we want that normally Parliament does is to say on something that's absolutely key to the nation's future, you have a completely free hand, come back in 2 years and tell us what you did, good luck. I mean, that's not how parliamentary democracy works.
But you're also unwilling to accept what the people did vote for last year. Both sides.
Nothing I've said about that changes the referendum.
No, your party is saying. Your party has been saying.
I'm talking about Parliament. I'm talking about Parliament. We're not There's members from most of in fact, I think every side has put down amendments here which are to be scrutinised in this bill, and that's what Parliament is for.
But your party has been saying that we need to keep the UK inside the single market, and that the referendum, yes, we voted to leave the EU, but we didn't vote to leave the single market. Well, that is a lie.
It's true,
because people on both sides of the referendum campaign said, if you vote to leave, we'll be out of the single market, and that is what the British people voted for.
What was on the ballot paper?
Well,
what was on the ballot paper?
The ballot paper question was, are we going to leave the European Union? But we had a campaign running for months beforehand in which senior figures on both sides made clear what the result would be.
Clearly, gentlemen, you're not going to agree on this particular issue. Let's just move away just very slightly. Now, the House of Lords has obviously been the subject of public attention for the last week or so because of what's been going on. But we're about to see a BBC documentary starting. I don't know whether you feature in it, Lord Teverson.
But I don't think so. No,
well, we've already had Baroness de Souza, who was the Lord Speaker until last year, sort of pointing out, sort of publicity for this, that she once left the House quite late and saw a peer, who is unfortunately nameless, jumping out of a taxi, leaving the engine running in just to prove that he'd attended so he could get his attendance allowance, and running out again. Is that representative of the House? I mean, she does say many members work incredibly hard, but is there a sort of a core of peers who really are not there and really pulling their weight?
Well, of course, you're talking to someone that believes the House of Lords should be completely destructured anyway, and changed. But I don't think it's anywhere near the majority at all. But even if it's a minority, it's unacceptable, isn't it? That's unacceptable behaviour.
Okay.
So the way that it works here is that we don't get salaries; we do get paid if we're there, which is a very straightforward to do, and we're the most, I think, the cheapest chamber that there is in the Western world.
So
having said that, no one should behave in that way.
So you're not sitting there every day sort of chafing at when you sort of see either empty seats or people who you know are not really at least endeavouring to do what the Lords are supposed to do.
Part of the House of Lords survives because people don't turn up. I mean, when they don't turn up, they don't get paid. But I mean, when you have a House that has 800 members, it's actually quite good if not everybody turns up. I mean, what normally happens is people turn up on things that they're interested in and have knowledge on. And in a certain way, that's what the House of Lords is for. But clearly, it should be absolutely fundamentally redesigned. In a modern world, an unelected House shouldn't really be acceptable. I agree.
Thank you very much indeed. That's Lord Teverson, who's Liberal Democrat peer. My thanks also to Jonathan Isaby, who is editor of BrexitCentral. Thank you very much indeed, both.
Share Radio.